Rahman Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. We were doing the record. We were doing yesterday the ayat in Surah Nisa. We're still there. We went all the way and we talked about لا يستوي القاعدون من المؤمنين. We went in details about the different deeds, how having the intention, even if you're not capable of doing the good deed, just by having the intention, you would basically get the reward for it. And we basically talked about the details in this ayah at least, and talked about the story behind it with Abdullah ibn Maktoum. We talked about that one, and we also talked about those that had, whether lisanul hal, whether that was speaking of their situation and their circumstances, or at least what they would be saying, or whether they literally had said كنا مستضعفين في الأرض, that they were vulnerable and that they couldn't migrate, and basically thought that that was a good excuse. And that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and even the malaika had responded to them that, well, the earth of the Lord Almighty was spacious enough for you to migrate in it. And we also, let's see right there, show it to you. We also went over the different details of what is permissible as to do in migration. What are the different reasons for migrating? And we talked about a number of different reasons that are considered as valid reasons for migrating. And of course, we were going back. So what we have in front of us here is basically Tafsir al-Qurtubi, and we talked about the right there, and we said some of it is basically to migrate because you are leaving the land or the city that basically has an abundance or at least a prevalent practice of haram. And we talked about leaving a certain city or a certain country because of the harm that basically maybe it has on your body. And we also talked about in fear of a certain illness within that place. And we also talked about the different reasons for travel, whether it's to seek, learning, the different examples based on what had happened to the previous nations. We also talked about traveling for Hajj, traveling for jihad, traveling for business and income, basically traveling for increase in income, and traveling for education, and traveling to basically seek the different places that are considered of high blessed places or highly blessed. Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, al-Masjid al-Haram, and al-Masjid Nabawi. We also talked about being in a place because it is in close proximity to the enemy. We also talked about visiting those that you would love for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We left off at this ayah. Basically, let's come see you and let you see, and here we go. So basically, we also talked about إلا المستضعفين من الرجال والنساء, and we went in details in terms of those that were excluded from at least the travel and where they are vulnerable, and the women, the children who had no means to travel, no means, and we talked about the different types of means. And those Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may forgive them, and the Lord Almighty is all forgiving. And we also went in details about may yuhajir fi sabilillah, and we talked about the differences of opinions on who and what name and which Sahabi that is. I guess the most important thing is that the story that the man, even though that Sahabi, even though he didn't actually have the means, or at least he was too weak, too sick to travel to Medina, which was obligatory at the time, but he still did it, and he had died in it Tan'im, which is still considered within the borders of Mecca. So he didn't even make it, but you could see right there, ثم يدركه الموت. So he didn't make it, but he put in the effort to migrate. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically said, وَقَعَ أَجْرُهُ عَلَى اللَّهِ. So even though he didn't make it, but the reward is basically going to be determined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is important to keep in mind. Even if you don't make it to the actual destination, or you don't make it to the actual, let's call it goal of what action you were supposed to be making, just by having the intention to do a particular thing, a particular action, that's the start, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would reward you for it. وَكَانَ اللَّهُ غَفُورًا رَحِيمًا. We left off at this ayah. وَإِذَا ضَرَبْتُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَلَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ أَن تَقْصُرُوا مِنَ الصَّلَاةِ وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَن يَفْتِنَكُمُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا إِنَّ الْكَافِرِينَ كَانُوا لَكُمْ عَدُوًّا مُبِينًا. So the word ضَرَبْتُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ, basically, I'm going to give you the wrong translation, literal translation, which is wrong. If you strike the earth, then there's no sin upon you to shorten from the prayers if you fear that the disbelievers might cause a trial onto you, for the disbelievers are a clear enemy to you. This is a horrible translation. Okay, it's because ضربتم في الأرض, this is not to be a literal translation, but this is to actually be a compound word, which is a metaphor. ضربتم في الأرض, it's not to strike on the earth, but the Arab used to use the word ضرب في الأرض to mean travel. And of course, compound words are even known, even in English, when we say driveway, parkway. All right, even though the driveway, it's not a place where you would actually drive in, but instead you would park your car in, and a parkway is supposed to be a place that you drive in. But ironically, I don't know why they're actually using the opposite. I wonder if it's the same in the British accent, but anyhow, at least this is the American accent, that the driveway is nothing to drive on, okay, but is basically a place to park your car in. All right, إِذَا ضَرَبْتُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ, this is not talking about striking on earth, but like I said, it is a metaphor to mean travel. All right, let's see. Now, one thing is that we know that during travel, there are certain eases that Islam had permitted. Number one, shortening the prayer. So when you say فَلَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ, this is a common word used in the Quran. فَلَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ, meaning that there is no sin. You're not held accountable. In fact, it is, let me use two words here because this is important. There's something called rukhsa and azima. All right? Rukhsa and al-azima. So what is a rukhsa and al-azima? Rukhsa is basically when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you the permission to do a particular, whether it's shortening, maybe perhaps not even fasting, etc. And I want you to look at this, in that when we're speaking about rukhsa, you're basically taking what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you as an excuse to shorten, to probably cancel out, to probably make into maybe on another day, etc. This is a rukhsa. Al-azima would basically be that you're taking the harder choice and not taking what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you as a permission. Now, what I want you to look at here, I want to take you to a hadith where inna Allah yuhibbu, I want you to look at here, an tu'ta rukhasu. Okay, I want you to see it right there. So this is the hadith. And of course, this is a really good website to go to. Let's see. So when you look at this hadith, here we go. So rukhsa is basically any ease. All right, so إن الله يحب أن تؤتى رخصه كما يحب أن تؤتى عزائمه. I want you to actually see the hadith, and we're going to go Control F, and we're going to say رخصه. Okay, hold on. So we could actually help you find it. Okay, and okay. So when you look at this hadith, you could see rukhsa is basically ease, any type of ease. And of course, it could be that tayammum, so ease. And of course, there is a general rule in Islam, is that whenever things have gotten harder, there's actually al-mashaqqa tajlibu al-taysir. Let me write that down for you. المشقة تجلب التيسير. المشقة تجلب التيسير is basically a general ruling, a legal maxim in Islam. It says المشقة تجلب التيسير. Whenever things are actually hard, there's going to be an ease coming to it, such as, for example, if it's hard for you to make that wudu, there's tayammum as in replace to it. And certainly, if you basically are facing severe hunger, there's an ease to it in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told you if there's the only food that's right there available is something that's probably blood or even pork food or even different foods that are haram to eat, it would be permissible to consume in situations where you had actually reached the level that's considered الضرورة. I want to write that word for you. So here it is, الضرورة, right there. So الضرورة basically means when your health, your life is in danger, or when your mental health, or even we're speaking about family, or whether we're speaking about your wealth. So those are considered the areas, but it's not for the random people to give themselves the justification and say, well, I've got a darura here. I'm not feeling good about doing this. It's affecting my mental health. No, we don't actually do it this way. We're speaking about certain rules on how we would get the legal maxims in place to make sure that we understand Islam based on the text and not based on our own intuitions or based on our own interpretations of what we want the text to say. So in general, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, here you could see, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. This is the general statement that the Lord Almighty wants ease for us and does not want hardship. So you could see that the whole statement is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to make things easy and not hard, but at the end of the day, you could see as an example of that is لَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ أَن تَقَصُرُوا مِنَ الصَّلَاةِ إِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَن يَفْتِنَكُمُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. There's no sin to shorten from the prayers if you fear that the disbelievers might actually attack you. And of course, someone might say, well, what if there was no fear? We're feeling safe. So here, that was a question that was basically given to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ, of course, here Umar ibn al-Khattab, he said, I asked the Prophet ﷺ about that, and he said, صَدَقَةٌ تَصَدَّقَ اللَّهُ بِهَا عَلَيْكُمْ فَاقْبَلُوا صَدَقَتَهُ. It's basically something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you. When you talk about sadaqah, sadaqah can mean donation and can also mean dismissal. So this is a dismissal that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you, then just accept the dismissal that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you. Don't jump into trying to make things harder on yourself. So what you're going to do is that you're going to take إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ أَن تُؤْتَى رُخَصُ كَمَا يُحِبُّ أَن تُؤْتَى عَزَائِمُ. You could see this is the hadith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala likes that people take even the dismissals as much this is not so as much as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would like that people would take the let's call it the honorable level and to go for a harder choice. So even for rukhsa, it is recommended that you would take the rukhsa as well. So here's the rukhsa and here's the azima. The easiest way to explain al-azima and the rukhsa, all right, is basically to look at if somebody, for example, was pulling the trigger and said, make kufr and bow down to the cross or I'll kill you. All right. If you were to say, well, I do have a reason here to save my life and it's a rukhsa. I'm given the permission that in situations where my life is at stake, I can actually do what's haram, at least in regards to this piece. Okay, so you bow down to the cross to save your life. This is a rukhsa. But let's say you thought to yourself that, no, I don't want to bow down to the cross because if I don't, at least I'll die a shaheed. Boom, you got killed. you're a shaheed at that moment. But which is better? Is being a shaheed better, or is taking the rukhsa better? To make the story short, scholars actually had differences of opinions in that regards, but just keep in mind, إن الله يحب أن تؤتى رخصه كما يحب أن تؤتى عزائمه. That the Lord Almighty loves that people would take the dismissals, take the permission to even do and do a particular, probably what would be regarded as sin in normal circumstances, as much as he would like that people would take the honorable and the complete ruling. You could say that there are a number of different narrators, and you could see that there are, let's see, Ibn Abd al-Barr had regarded it, let's see, thabit, that it was proven at least authentic. Al-Haythami had mentioned it in Kashf al-Asrar. All right, so at the end, it's basically to help us recognize that you've got the resource to prove that you can even take the eases. So let's see, ليس عليكم جناح أن تقصروا من الصلاة, to basically shorten the prayer. How does shortening the prayer, and what does that even look like? So what that looks like is basically that you're shortening Salat al-Dhuhr, Salat al-Asr, and Salat al-Isha. Basically, only the prayers that are 4 rak'ahs would basically become 2 rak'ahs. So it would be shortening only the 4 rak'ah salats. So in that situation, it's important to keep in mind that scholars had differences of opinions on whether doing the 4 rak'ahs into 2, on whether that is better, or whether doing it as a 4, especially during our times. It could be some people are like, oh, I'm traveling first class and I'm finding it easy. I've got so much free time and I'll just pray my asr for 4 rak'ahs anyways. I'm in the first class and I've got the little space and all of that, especially if you're flying on Singapore Airlines. I've got, it kind of looks like a different spacious area. So you've got space for it, and you decided to actually pray the actual numbering for Salah and not actually go for the shortening prayers during your travel. So let's say some scholars had regarded that it is obligatory to shorten the prayer when you're traveling. Others regarded that it's a rukhsa, it's permissible and not necessarily obligatory. Let's see, and the ones that had actually said that it was obligatory, they said, well, Sayyidah Aisha had mentioned in a hadith that is salah rak'atayn, that it was obligated in the first and early times of Islam, 2 by 2 rak'ahs. So of course you could see that this hadith was, so some actually regarded that this basically is speaking about travel, and others basically considered it as that no, this was talking about not the traveler, but this was the early times of Islam. All right, so to make the story short,
before the ayah that came about salah, right?
Right. So when we're speaking about taqsuru min as-salah, you're shortening the prayer during your travel. And of course, Ali ibn Abi Talib and the other Sahaba, they knew more about what the different etiquettes that the Prophet ﷺ was doing. In fact, Sayyidah Aisha herself actually said, when she was asked about how long they could wipe on their khuf, or which is like a sock, really, how long they could wipe on that. And she basically said, well, go to Ali. He would know more about that because he would be the one with him during the travel. And then Ali ibn Abi Talib said, well, it's for 3 days and 3 nights. But she would know more about the information that is private information, because she was with the Prophet ﷺ. So this is in order to teach us that we take all the Sahaba as resources to help us know about the details of Islam, to help us know the details of what we need to practice, and basically the ones to have transmitted the information about the Prophet ﷺ. So here you could see that they basically had differences of opinions. Is doing it in short, is doing it incomplete better, and all of that. I'm not going to go in details. In Maliki basically said, well, they would basically have the choice. They could decide to make it complete, and they could decide to make it short. And of course, simply because the ayah says, فَلَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ, that there's no sin, really leaving it as optional for you and not mandatory that you have to shorten the prayer. And of course, القصر في السفر للرجال والنساء سنة. So in general, you're looking at shortening the prayer for men and women. It's basically a sunnah, at least in the madhab Maliki. All right, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Abu Umar, and when we speak about Abu Umar, just to note, Abu Umar is basically also called or also named Ibn Abdul Barr. Ibn Abdul Barr, maybe we could actually look into Ibn Abdul Barr for a second, because he's a very, very important scholar, right? I'm going to show you Ibn Abdul Barr. I want you to see, and of course, it's not like we have a picture for him, but at least you would know some of the most important books that he had actually written. All right, let's say Ibn Abdul Barr, and you could see, of course, let's look at some of the images right there. Yeah, we're not going to find, this isn't Ibn Abdul Barr. All right. Ibn Abdul Barr, here's a book, Al-Isti'ab, which is in almost 5 volumes. And of course, I guess the most important book for Ibn Abdul Barr is really this book. Let's see, this book is huge. You could see this book is a huge book. It's called At-Tamheed. And of course, At-Tamheed is a huge book. It's in 17 volumes. And what he did in that book, of course, it isn't the only book, but what he did in that book, he went to al-Muwatta, which is really in one volume, I mean, an 800-page volume, and he went in details to do the explanation. So Ibn Abdul Barr, or Abu Umar, is basically the most important figure in the madhab Maliki to explain al-madhab al-Maliki. So this would basically be considered one of the most important books for al-madhab Maliki. And I guess it's important to learn about Ibn Abdul Barr, especially if we're talking about At-Tamheed. Al-Istidhkar right there. This is another book. I want you to see all of these if you're looking at how and what we're talking about. So let's see right there, and where you're talking about al-Istidhkar, something really similar, in where you could see it's in 9 volumes. And these books are actually available for free. You can actually find these books available for free and simply as a PDF. And where would I find that? Simple, really, really simple. And the place to find the books at is basically, one, you could find them in Islam Web, and Shamila, Al-Maktab Al-Shamila basically has all those books for Ibn Abdul Barr. Okay, has all those books. And let's see, and right there they kind of did like a short bio. And of course, Al-Insaf, Al-Istidhkar, those are just names for some of the books that he had written. And of course, At-Tamheed, there, it has a number of different printouts. And of course, Al-Kafi, those are just the names. Okay, so Ibn Abdul Barr, he basically died 463 Hijriya, and he was actually nicknamed Hafidh al-Maghrib. Hafidh al-Maghrib to mean not al-Maghrib, Morocco, but al-Maghrib to mean al-Maghrib is to mean Tunisia, to mean Algeria, to mean Morocco, to mean Mauritania. That was all considered al-Maghrib, not necessarily the country Morocco. He was born in Qurtuba. Where's Qurtuba? It's basically Andalus. And of course, later died in Shatiba, which was also part of Al-Andalus. Now, mind you, remember, he actually died 463 Hijriya, and which is equivalent. This is Miladi. This is basically Miladi to mean the Gregorian calendar. All right, but it's important. Yeah, oh, sure. We can, inshallah, share those links, inshallah. So this is just an idea about Ibn Abd al-Barr, and hopefully, we could learn about different scholars as we go along, and rather than just have different names. So let's see, what did he say? And he said, well, this is enough to know what the madhab is, and there's no differences of opinions that you can actually pray a complete prayer that is 4 rak'ahs and not shorten it, as long as, okay, and of course, and let's say, إن من أتم في السفر يعيد ما دام في الوقت وذلك استحباب عند من فهم لا إجاب. So it's basically saying that if you had basically prayed during your travel, then therefore يعيد ما دام في الوقت. If, let's say, you reach your destination, all right, let's say you reach your destination, and what we're speaking about destination is basically home. All right, if you reached home. So let's say you were traveling from one city, and of course 3 hours later or 2 hours later, you basically had reached your destination home. Then in that situation, if there wasn't enough time, that you would actually redo the prayer if there was enough time. But not all scholars would necessarily agree with that. They would say, well, if you had prayed shortening the prayer and it was within the time, then that's it. You don't have to redo it if you basically had reached your destination and there was enough time. But we're speaking about here that not you're redoing all the prayers. We're speaking about there was that particular prayer that there was enough time, just one last prayer, just the last prayer that you had time. But all the other prayers that you had shortened, you do not make up, you do not whatsoever make up in a complete form. That's it. They're considered as past, they're considered as complete, and of course considered that it was a permission that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you to shorten the prayers, the 4 rak'ah prayers, and making it into 2. All right. And all right, so Shafi'i said they basically had differences of opinions. That's not what he said, but because they had differences of opinions looking at the ayah. I want you to look at the ayah once again. The ayah was basically saying, in khiftum ayaftinakum alladhina kafaru, that there's no sin, to shorten from the prayer, if you fear the fitna from alladhina kafaru. So the scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether this condition that is mentioned in this ayah, in khiftum, on whether this in khiftum is only in situations where you fear that you might be attacked, that there's some danger on you, etc. So some scholars said that no, there has to be that you're afraid. But other scholars, and majority of the scholars, based on the hadith, which is the preponderant, is that even if you're not afraid, and even if there's no danger on you, that you could still shorten the prayers. All right. And here, Shafi'i quote said, Al-qasru fi ghayri al-khawfi bis-sunnah, that we're shortening our prayers even when we're not afraid. Basically, the evidence is basically derived from the sunnah, from the actions of the Prophet ﷺ, the reports of the Prophet ﷺ. As for why are we shortening our prayers when we're traveling? Why are we shortening our prayers during travel? He basically said, well, our evidence is Quran and Sunnah. In other words, he's basically saying, even in the Sunnah, we've got an evidence that we're allowed to shorten the prayers, even when there's no danger. We find that in the Sunnah. And whoever prays 4 rak'ahs, فَلَا شَيْءَ عَلَيْهِ. In other words, they're not held accountable. They can pray 4 rak'ahs, even though it is, and he said, quote Shafi'i said, وَلَا أُحِبُّ لِأَحَدٍ أَن يُتِمَّ فِي السَّفَرِ رَغْبَةً عَنِ السُّنَّةِ. And quote, he said, and I don't like it that anybody would complete to make it in 4 rak'ahs, because to do that is basically turning away from the sunnah. In other words, to take the sunnah and pray 4 rak'ahs is basically what's best. So the other question is, in general, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِذَا طُمَأْنَنْتُمْ فَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ. If you feel that, إِذَا طُمَأْنَنْتُمْ, if you feel that you're safe, if you feel that you're content, then complete it. But we know that the Prophet ﷺ had basically قصر الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم من 4 إلى 2 إلا المغرب. So we know that the Prophet ﷺ had basically prayed the 4 rak'ahs into 2, except al-Maghrib. In all the times that the Prophet ﷺ had prayed Maghrib, it was never less than 3. And of course, whether he was in security or whether he was in fear, all of that is basically taken from the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. All right. And of course, we said the hadith, تِلْكَ صَدَقَةٌ تَصَدَّقَ اللَّهُ بِهَا عَلَيْكُمْ فَاقْبَلُوا صَدَقَتَهُ. It's basically a dismissal from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then accept the dismissal. So therefore, just take it. Now, when we look at that, in where another quote, Abu Handar an Ibn Umar, that was asked, Ibn Umar was asked about Salat al-Safar, and he said, it's 2 rak'ahs. And he said, so where's the ayah where it says, in other words, how did you not include it in the whole logic of shortening the prayer, in where the ayah says, and if you fear that the disbelievers might harm you, and he said, and we're safe here. And he said, well, I've got it from the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, what's important about all of this is understanding that the sunnah itself, that is the prophetic reports, the prophetic words, the prophetic actions, act as a reference and as a resource on their own. And therefore, you would take that as a valid resource, even when you might see an ayah say otherwise. Therefore, this is not to contradict it, but this is one side, and the sunnah is to complete it. So in other words, in order to see the matters, you would basically have to make sure you're taking the 2 resources together, combining the 2 resources to understand Islam right. Because if you're just taking one source and you're leaving the other, then you actually have a myopic vision. You're not seeing the complete picture of what the Prophet ﷺ had explained and interpreted what the Quran is actually saying. So the other question is, how far is basically considered, and what is the distance that is considered as a travel? So you could say that there are differences of opinions. Some had actually said 3 amyal. Now I want to look at the word amyal, because the mile today during our time is basically different than the unit that is basically used in the Islamic sense. So that a mile in Islamic sense is almost 1,848 meters. So that's approximately 1.1 miles of today's miles. So when we're talking about 3
So how
miles,
many minutes would that be?
well, depends on how fast you're going, Noura.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Okay.
Noura,
Sorry.
physics, Noura.
I wasn't listening in that, sorry.
It's okay. Of course, in order to pass a certain distance, it depends on how fast you're going, right? That's in physics. Oh, that's all right. All right. So when we're talking about 3 miles in the sunnah sense, we're talking about approximately 3 miles. And of course, that was during their time. It's actually walking distance. Okay, 3 miles walking distance. And of course, some actually had taken this opinion, but the other scholars, and of course, Ibn al-Arabi said, قَدْ تَلَاعَبَ قَوْمٌ بِالدِّينِ. He said, this is really playing. In other words, this is being ridiculous. And some people are basically using the religion and misinterpreting the religion, and they're being ridiculous in the way they would adopt and interpret the religion. In other words, there's no way. And he said, right there, Ibn al-Arabi. Ibn al-Arabi is different than Ibn Arabi, the Sufi guy. We'll talk about him in just a bit. All right. And he said, whoever would say, in other words, these 3 miles, that you would shorten the prayer, he said, it must be that this person is ajami. In other words, they know nothing about the Arabic language, doesn't know what travel means according to, of course, al-Arab. And this is a person that is not taking their deen seriously. And he said, if it wasn't mentioned by some scholars, I would have not even given it a glance, not even have thought about it. And this is important. So now you can go in details and you could see that what really makes a travel is not necessarily in distance per se, but it's also what would be considered at that time, or what would be considered as travel. So during our times, a 3-mile distance, if you were to drive probably 5 miles per hour, you could, or not 5 miles per hour, but I mean 40 miles per hour, a 3-mile distance would only take you what, 10 minutes? Would only take you 10 minutes? That makes no sense. Because during our times, that travel, that's not a travel. That's not a travel. You cannot consider that as a travel. So that's why some scholars, they basically had considered that the distance is basically, and keep in mind, if you're going to say that that's a travel, you're going to have to remember that the Prophet ﷺ said it is not permissible for a woman that believes in Allah and Judgment Day to actually travel a distance of a day without having a mahram. So in every single time you're going to go a 3-mile distance, you're going to take a mahram with you. Oh man, you're going to go grocery shopping. Oh, I have to take my mahram with me. Oh man, look at the cart and look at the fight in the grocery.
What a hardship that would be.
Exactly. And what a hardship that would be if you're going to be. And the last thing your husband would want to do is really come grocery shopping with you, right? Because they don't want to see you looking into the ingredients and looking at that. They just want to get over it and finish up. All right. Anyhow, so when you look at, to make the story short, and I'm not going to go into all the details, you could see that they were speaking about arba'ati burud. And they went in detail and said that the Prophet ﷺ would do al-fitr. In other words, break the fast, because if you're going to consider that as a travel, then what that means is that you can break the fast in it, and you can even shorten the prayer in it. So certainly, if we're talking about a 10-minute drive, there's no way that we can break the fast in a 10-minute drive and say, oh, now I'm on a journey. I'm actually traveling after a 10-minute drive, or even shortening the prayer. So you could see that when we're speaking about what makes up as a travel, the preponderant ruling is that it is about 80 kilometers, and that's when, and what would actually be considered as a travel. So something equivalent to 80 kilometers, and that way even you can break your fast. And of course, you would not start from the day that you intend to travel, but from the day that you would actually, from the time that you would be considered at the day that you would be considered as that you had already departed your area of residence. So we're talking about that distance. So when and what is the area of residence? So we're looking at 80 kilometers. So we're looking at 80 kilometers in that. And of course, the question is, does that mean it has to be only for a travel like to Hajj, or a travel for some kind of a jihad, etc.? No. So it couldn't be any type, even if you're going to visit I guess, your relatives, or probably going to visit an ill person, or going for jihad, or going for umrah, or even going to school. So if it's considered that, or even going for a business, if it's considered that it is a permissible journey that you're doing, then in that situation, you can shorten the prayer. So here, Ata, who's Ata ibn Abi Rabah, we had mentioned him, and he had actually died 110 Hijriya almost. A couple classes ago, I had said that al-Badri died 195 Hijriya. That was a mistake. Al-Badri died 310 Hijriya. So just on the side, just so that we would correct that information. All right. Ata, who's a scholar from the Tabi'in, he said, لا تقصر إلا في سفر طاعة وسبيل من سبل الخير. Quote, he said, you would not shorten the prayer except if this was a permissible or a travel that is obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, a travel that is permissible in Islam, and something that would be considered a permissible and a door of good and piety. All right. In other words, it's basically in safar mubah. It's a permissible safar. It's a permissible journey. In other words, if you're going gambling, God forbid, okay, you can't say, well, I'm actually here. I'm going to, I guess, Mystic Lake, and I'm traveling, and it's more than 80 miles, and therefore, yeah, I'm going gambling, but I want to shorten the prayers because I'm actually away from the city. No, you can't actually do that, because this is not a safar ta'a. This is not an obedience or a travel for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Astaghfirullah. Sorry. Yes, definitely. I just wanted to, mention that, because it's really sad. We do have some people that might actually misunderstand Islam. All right. So al-jumhur, majority scholars, they said, لا قصر في سفر المعصية. There is no qasr, there is no shortening when the person is traveling to commit a sin. All right. Yet Abu Hanifa and al-Awza'i, who's a scholar from Lebanon, he basically said it is permissible to shorten the prayer because it is irrelevant for why you're actually going. It's irrelevant, and therefore you're basically shortening the prayer based on the evidence, and it's irrelevant. The reason why you're going is irrelevant to how you're dealing with the prayer. So that's quite interesting, and quite interesting. And remember, when we want to prove or disprove a point, we have to base it on evidence in Islam, and it's not based on how you feel about it. This is extremely important. It's not based on how you feel about it. And they basically based it, إِذَا ضَرَبْتُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَلَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ. They said, well, this is the comprehensive word. And it says, if you travel, then there's no sin to shorten the prayer. And it didn't necessarily say that it has to be travel for good, something permissible or not. All right. And they said, this basically, this would include any type of a travel. I want to look at those differences of opinions just so that you would see that sometimes when you would ask a sheikh, and sometimes you would get some answer, and you would ask another sheikh, and he would give you another answer, and you're like, well, what does Islam really say? You have to keep in mind that the text itself, there are different ways to interpret it, but it's not you and I that create the interpretation. We would basically look at the interpretation where it's based on 1, the ayat, 2, the ahadith, 3, the Arabic language, and 4, what was agreed upon between the scholars, and 5, like the Sahaba and how they had interpreted it. And of course, there are other evidences, but it's important that we would make the interpretation in the lens of Quran and Sunnah, how it was interpreted. So because it is going to be really hard for you to probably go over all the hadith that relate to probably the matter that you're researching, that's why you basically had these scholars that studied all the kutub al-sitta and all the books of fiqh and all the books of tafsir and all the books of Quran and all the qira'at and all of that stuff to make it easy for you. In other words, they processed all of that and they would give you that answer in an easy note, and where do you really have to go back to all of those references and miss out on any references without you knowing? All right, let's see this quote that the Prophet ﷺ actually said, خَيْرُ عِبَادِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ إِذَا سَافَرُوا قَصَرُوا وَأَفْطَرُوا. Let's look at this hadith. So we've got number one, this is the footnote, and that it was actually mentioned in al-Tabarani. Whenever we would go for al-Tabarani, it's very important that we would go for this book, al-Haythami, and his book is called Majma' al-Zawaid. Majma' al-Zawaid is in approximately 10 volumes, 9 volumes. All right. And what he did was basically go for Musnad Ahmad, go for Tabarani, go for al-Bazzar, and go for other books and Abu Ya'la, etc., and actually explain those hadith. And not only explain, but he's more concerned about figuring out whether this hadith and its chain of narration on whether they're authentic or not. So here's our favorite al-Haythami, who's actually Shafi'i madhab, just a note. And he said, well, there's a certain narrator, and his name is Ibn Lahi'a or Luhay'a. So Lahi'a is more common to actually say his name, and where he said that this basically is not an authentic hadith. And in fact, Abu Hatim, who's basically a scholar and the most important scholar in a very important field in the science of hadith, it is called the Ilal. And what that is, it's basically looking at these hidden reasons as to why certain hadith are considered weak or not. And he said that this is basically mentioned by this narrator, and he is munkar al-hadith. Munkar al-hadith, in where he might say a hadith that is not necessarily a hadith that other better, or let me call them a higher level of scholars, they had mentioned a hadith, and therefore this hadith, he basically said, is munkar al-hadith. It's his hadith that is the narrator within this hadith is basically not an acceptable narrator. I want you to look at, and of course there's Ibn Hajar and his Talkhis al-Habib, but I want you to look at this, and where, just to quote, the best of the servants of Allah are the ones that when they would travel, they would shorten the prayer and even break their fast. But this hadith is not authentic. Sometimes I'm going to say, so those hadith, even if they're not authentic, just so that when you're asked about a certain narration, that you would know how to answer it, and you wouldn't go into some confusion, because remember, most misconceptions happen when people don't have the ilm. So they would not have the ilm about that hadith is not authentic, and then when they get this hadith that's not an authentic hadith, then they go into all these confusions, like, okay, how do I respond? What do I do? Well, that's why we're actually doing this, giving these details to help us understand what Islam really says. And certainly the most important thing, which to me I always care about, is the part about reference. If you know your references, if you know the authenticity of your references, then you are basically setting your grounds in making your logic, your statement, your vision in place. All right. We're going to make other, inshallah, other answers or questions, and put out other answers to many questions. And they had differences of opinions, like I said, on the distance, and some have actually said just when you leave the city, and we mentioned that one earlier. So I'm going to go farther if my laptop would basically help me. All right. And when do we start? Basically, here we go. So we're talking about here, some scholars had actually said once you're away by 7 miles. All right, so this is that opinion based on the hadith. But of course, this is talking about if we're talking about somebody that is going on foot at that time. Okay, so when
Yeah,
we're talking about
that would take a long time.
that would take a long time. But if you're driving 7 miles, oh, that would be what? In 25 minutes you would get there? So that's not
Maybe
too far.
less.
Maybe less even. Exactly. Well, if the person's driving at 30 miles per hour. I don't know why they would be going that slow, but anyhow. All right. All right. So when do we actually start our shortening the prayer or even breaking the fast? Not from the intention of travel. What does that mean? Let's say I'm basically having the intention that today I booked my flight to go to Brunei or Singapore, whatever. Okay. And my flight is going to be 2 hours from now. And the flight didn't tell me it was canceled. So that means I'm traveling today and during the day of Ramadan. Does that mean I can start shortening from now? No, not until you actually go on the plane, not before it starts take off. No, not until it takes off by a couple minutes. Okay, that's when you're considered that you can break your fast. So not by the intention, today I've got a flight, but not until the plane takes off and actually takes off and leaves the area of residence is when you can shorten the prayer and certainly break your fast as well. All right. And of course, when we're speaking about traveling, so how long can I actually shorten my prayer for? So let's say I'm going to Singapore, for example. I know everybody's like, okay, what's up with the Singapore thing? Okay, let's say I'm going to Singapore and I'm going to stay there for a week. Can I shorten my prayer during the whole week, or is it only for up to 3 days? Okay, let's say. So scholars actually had differences of opinions on that, on how long. Is it for up to 15 days, or is it up to 4 days, or is it up to 3 days, or is it up to 3 days, or is it up to probably as long as you're considered not home, you're considered a traveler. So those are the different opinions. Just wanted to lay them out so that we would be aware of them. So let's say here you would see Malik Shafi'i and Layth, they all said if you are intending to stay for up to 4 days, then that situation you would basically pray it as a complete prayer because you're basically 4 days. That's a form of residency. That's what they consider it, that it's basically residency. Abu Hanifa and the Thawri, they said if you intend to stay 15 days and above, then in that situation, you would basically complete it because they considered that it's like 2 weeks and a day. That would mean that you're a resident in that area. This is your new place of stay, basically. And if it is less, then you would basically shorten the prayer. Let's see. Al-Hanbali, they said if the person had basically decided to stay 21 days, 21 salat, 21 prayers. So 21 prayers, that would mean 5 times 21, 4. So basically 5 prayers, 5 days. No, you're going to pray 5 prayers. Okay, so what do you got? 4 days? So basically within that? Okay, let's see. And he said, let's see, Al-Qurtubi says, وَالصَّحِيحُ مَا قَالَهُ مَالِك. And what is right? That's because he's Maliki, of course, that is Al-Qurtubi. And he basically said that what was said is that the Prophet ﷺ basically said for the person that's migrating, if they were to stay in Mecca for 3 days, okay, after 3 days, it would be considered that within the 3 days, so this is the Maliki, if you're staying 3 days and above, beyond the 3 days, that would be considered as a resident. where did they get that from? Let's see where they got that from. They
And
said,
the
well,
Shafi'i, was that the 15-day one?
the Shafi'i, they basically said, let's see, what did they say? Where's the, I skipped it. Okay, so here we go. So Shafi'i, they basically said 4 days.
4 days.
Okay.
Okay.
4 days. Okay, so where were we? Oh no, we got lost. Oh boy. Okay, here we go. So yeah, so basically the evidence that they used is that the Prophet ﷺ, when they had basically went uh, basically for Hijrah, before Hijrah, all right, and they were basically not permitted to stay in Mecca, and the amount of times that he had given was basically 3 days to finish off what they needed to do. Okay. And same thing when he basically had expelled the Jews from Medina, he basically gave them 3 days to finish all their business. And of course, Ibn al-Arabi, he said that basically is similar to when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, تَمَتَّعُوا فِي دَارِكُمْ ثَلَاثَةَ أَيَّامٍ, that you're just going to have 3 days as basically a pending moment. A pending moment, and ذلك وعد غير مكذوب, and then that's it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just giving you 3 days because that's going to be the pending time. All right, so this is, I think that's a very strong opinion, really, because if you're staying longer than 3 days, that means you're actually staying. But it's really important to see that some scholars or even some Sahaba, let's look at this. So some Sahaba, they actually stayed longer and were still doing shortening. Let's say they said, as long as you're not considered as really the resident in that place and you're still traveling. Let's say Anas, he basically stayed in Naysabur for 2 years, and he would still shorten the prayer. So he stayed in for 2 years away from Medina, that is, because he's originally from Medina. But for 2 years, he would even shorten the prayer. Abu Majlis had said, I told Ibn Umar that I would إني آتي المدينة فأقيم بها 7 أشهر و8 طالبا حاجة. قال صلي ركعتين. So Abu Majlis told Ibn Umar, said, I would come to a city. This is not in Medina to mean coming to Medina, but I would come to a city and I would stay in it for 7 or 8 months, basically to finish up a certain matter. And he told him, just pray 2 rak'ahs. Let's see. Abu Ishaq al-Sabi'i said, we stayed in Sajistan. In Sajistan, I would believe that it's a city in either Iran or Uzbekistan. Don't take my word for it. And he said, and we were a group of men, including, or of course, from Ibn Mas'ud's friend, and we would pray 2 rak'ahs. Let's see, Ibn Umar stayed in Azerbaijan for 6 months, and he would pray 2 rak'ahs. That is basically the 4 rak'ahs make them into 2. And he said that the reason for that, كان الثلج حال بينهم وبين القفول. It was the snow that prevented them from going back. So imagine snow, if you're going and walking, imagine the snow and imagine the cold. I'm sure it's going to be way into the below if they were traveling. All right, let's see. Abu Umar, who basically is Ibn Abdul Bar, the guy that we talked about earlier, and he said, what these hadith, that is basically all these stories about these different scholars and these different tabi'in that were who were shortening the prayers. He said it was basically, how do you understand it? How do they explain it? They said, لا نية لواحد من هؤلاء المقيمين هذه المدة. They didn't intend to stay that long, but it was every single day they would probably say to themselves that we're going to be leaving today, we're going to be leaving tomorrow, and then they ended up really, staying for 6 months or 7 months, and then they ended up shortening every single day. In other words, they didn't intend to stay 7 months, or else they would have considered themselves as residents. All right, let's say. Okay, I'm just going to, because it's 1:47, so what I'll do, I'll leave off right here and make the story, inshallah, ending right here, and we'll continue, inshallah, not tomorrow? Yeah. Tomorrow is, what's today? Oh, tomorrow's Eid? Okay, so not tomorrow, maybe in 4 days from now, inshallah. So كل سنة وانتم سالمين, like we say, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala تقبل طاعتكم, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your prayers, accept your fast, accept your dhikr, accept your tilawa, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah.
Sorry, I'm the annoying question person. So I have a question. I was listening to a sheikh explain about Laylatul Qadr and us not saying that because there's only 29 days in Ramadan. So basically, in the months where it turns out to be 30, then it's actually on the even nights. I don't know where that came from, but
You mean
that,
Laylatul Qadr, if it's on the 30th?
yes.
No,
Like he was saying that we have to because if when it's 30 days or 30 nights for Ramadan, that it could be the even nights because it's not 29. And I was like, huh?
well, the hadith was really straightforward, that it is on a day of witr. It would be on a day of witr and not necessarily, and I want you to look at right there. I'm going to show you this hadith right there. Let's see. Here we go. I'm going to show you this hadith right there in where the Prophet, let's see, this hadith. The Prophet رأيت ليلة القدر ثم أخذني, no, this hadith. Basically, hold on. I'm going to show you the hadith here so you could see it. Okay. روى البخاري في صحيحه, here we go, that السيدة عائشة تتحروا ليلة القدر في الوتر من العشر الأواخر من رمضان. That the Prophet actually said, seek ليلة القدر in الوتر. So الوتر actually means odd days from the last 10 nights of Ramadan. All right? The last 10 nights of Ramadan. So you're basically going
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Right. So what?
So I don't know where he got that, but anyway.
Yeah,
sorry.
so here we go. So here's the hadith right there. It's narrated in Bukhari and Muslim. Can you actually see what I'm doing? Yes. You could see this hadith is basically narrated Bukhari and Muslim right there in where تحروا ليلة القدر في العشر الأواخر من رمضان. Let's see. And the Prophet ﷺ then tells Abu Hurairah the same thing. فَالْتَمِسُوهَا فِي الْعَشْرِ الْغَوَابِرِ. عشر الغوابر, meaning the last 10 nights. And let's see. And he said, التمسوها في السبع الغوابر فالتمسوها. So here's another hadith, basically going for the last, basically 7 days, or even the last 9 days. Oh, I don't know why it's telling me that the internet connection is going low. All right. So basically, just to look at that piece of it, in where, let's say, التمسوها في العشر الأواخر من رمضان ليلة القدر في 9 تبقى في 7 تبقى في 5 تبقى. Look at this hadith, and where the Prophet ﷺ said you would seek it in the last 10 days of Ramadan. Laylat al-Qadr is, it could be on the 9th, it could be on the 7th, could be on the 5th, and you could see it right there. And basically, to give you when it's a 9, 7, a 5th, it's basically an odd number and not, of course, an even number. All right. And here the Prophet ﷺ actually said, فَإِنْ ضَعُفَ أَحَدُكُمْ أَوْ عَجَزْ فَلَا يُغْلَبَنَّ عَلَى السَّبْعِ الْبَوَاقِي. In other words, if you were not doing a really good job and you were weakened to basically do a good qiyam during the first days of Ramadan, well, at least don't miss the last 7 days. All right, you could see it right there, this hadith. All right, so this is, I guess, to bring about Wallahi inni la'alamuha. Ubay bin Ka'b said, I know which night it is, that is Laylat al-Qadr, وأكثر علمي هي الليلة التي أمرنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بقيامها هي ليلة 27. So let's see, here's narrated by Muslim. Ubay bin Ka'b, he said, I know which night it is, and it is based on my knowledge that the Prophet ﷺ had ordered us to do qiyam. It is the 27th night. And so this is just to help us. Let's see. ليلة صبيحة 27 وأمارتها أن تطلع الشمس في صبيحة يومها بيضاء لا شعاع لها. So here's some of the signs. Ubay bin Ka'b said it's basically the night or the morning of 27th, and the sign for it is when you would see the sun going out in its sunrise, in where it is white and it does not have any rays in it. So this is, just a fast thing. I hope I answered that question.
Yeah,
What is
just
a hadith mursal? So the sister is asking, what is a hadith mursal? So a hadith mursal is basically when you would have some of the narrators didn't actually say who that narrator is. And of course, they basically would skip certain narrators and they would jump to probably say, and say other narrators, and you basically have missing links. So those would be hadith mursal, not that there is a hadith that someone sent. No. So it's basically certain narrators, and you could actually, a very important book for ilm al-hadith. All right, so let's say ilm al-hadith, you could actually go back. Ilm al-hadith, riwaya and diraya. You could actually, let's see, ilm al-hadith, the books for ilm al-hadith, you could actually study, let's see, if you speak Arabic, you could actually go back to kutub. I guess the most one is for Tahan. Maybe I could use that in ilm al-hadith, and that would probably be, here we go, Tafsir Mustalah al-Hadith, Mahmoud al-Tahan. This is probably a really good book. You can even get it right there as a PDF, and you could even upload the book and download the book and all of that. So you can download the book and let's see, and he'll give you all those sciences and the technical terms of what those ahadith are. This is the book, and you can actually find out the terms. You can go all the way to the end, basically. And let's see, we can go back. Yeah, this is pretty cool. So here we go. And you can see here, here's al-mursal al-khafi there. He's giving you all the details of what a mursal is. Let's make this bigger so we can actually see it, right? Here we go. So basically he's telling you the different kinds, and here we go. Different kinds of mursal. Here's al-mudallas, and here is al-hadith al-mursal. So basically page 87. Let's go back to page 87 and actually see what he says, right? And that way I'm just teaching you how to do it rather than me telling you what it really is. Okay, so here we go. Let's go to page 87. Give me page 87, 84, 85, 86, 87. So it basically said ما سقط من آخر إسناده من بعد التابعي. So basically the hadith that basically had left a narrator after التابعي. Okay, so basically here, one of the narrators after التابعي, okay, which basically is a Sahabi, you could see that they did not basically mention the Sahabi. So you've got, for example, there would be a Tabi'i who would basically say the Prophet ﷺ had done this or said this. But what we basically find in the hadith is that, well, wait a minute, you didn't even hear the Prophet ﷺ. How did you say that the Prophet ﷺ said this? So they basically did not mention the narrator that's a Sahabi within the hadith. Okay, so this is basically what it means. So now you know al-mursal. Now there is al-mursal and al-fuqaha al-usuliyin. So this is just to give you an idea, and let me give you the book. I'm going to give it to you so you could actually see it. Probably a very good book for those that would. And remember, you can actually have this PDF downloaded, and then you can make it translated. You can get it translated AI. Doesn't really give you the same level, but it's almost 75% accuracy. So it would really come in, I guess, as a good resource. The most important book for ilm al-hadith is basically called Tadrib al-Rawi. Okay, Tadrib al-Rawi, this is the book, Tadrib al-Rawi, and Tadrib al-Rawi, let's see, Imam al-Suyuti is probably one of the most important books. And of course, the most important scholar for ilm al-hadith, his name is Ibn al-Salah, in where ulum al-hadith is basically what he had written. And of course, here we go, Ibn al-Salah and ulum al-hadith. This is the most important reference to teach about Muqaddimat Ibn al-Salah. Here we go. This basically is the book. This is the most important book. And let me give you the resource. You could even right there, you could download the book and actually get it. But it's an advanced book. So I'm just letting you know what's out there, but that doesn't mean this is the only thing. But if you were to go back to the book that I just gave you about Ulum al-Hadith for the Tahan, that's a very good resource. So I hope that explains it, inshallah. Of course, he doesn't have to look like this, but any other question? I guess this is it. We'll see you all, inshallah, hopefully 4 days from now. And hopefully, inshallah, we'll see how we want to do this. Certainly, it's not going to be every day because we're going to have other classes as well. But we'll, inshallah, continue with the extensive and the comprehensive tafsir until we finish all the Quran, inshallah. We in Surah, inshallah, from Surah Nisa, we're on ayah 101. So it's pretty good, really. Okay, pretty good. So we only have these pages left because, of course, Surah Nisa is until 176. So technically, we only have 75 ayat left, which is pretty good. You know, this surah is actually one of the most surahs that had details in fiqh. And for me to actually go about with at least summarizing the tafsir for this, I would say is pretty hard for me to summarize it because I could easily get carried away with going into details. So the sister says, what time and days after Eid? We'll put out, inshallah,
like a schedule, yeah,
like a
announcement,
schedule.
yeah,
right. So I don't even know myself really, but if you like to, I guess.
But the other classes, inshallah, will be restarting on next Monday, inshallah.
Inshallah. So if you would like a suggestion on certain days, put it out there, Latifa, and we'll take it in consideration, inshallah. So this is it, and barakallahu feekum. We're going to stop the recording.